The smell hit him first. Then he saw the bones. It was a crisp autumn morning in 1978, and Dale Hutchins had been tracking deer through the dense backwoods of Rutherford County, Tennessee, for nearly 3 hours. The forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls, the kind of peaceful solitude that kept him coming back season after season. But then the wind shifted, carrying with it something that didn't belong, a sickly, sweet odor that made his stomach turn and his instincts scream that something was terribly, horribly wrong. Dale slowed his pace, his rifle suddenly feeling heavier in his hands. Every hunter knows the smell of death, a deer carcass left too long, a coyote that didn't make it through winter. But this was different. This was stronger, more human. He pushed through a thicket of overgrown brush, branches scraping against his jacket, and that's when he saw it. Partially concealed beneath a carpet of fallen leaves and tangled undergrowth, a human skull stared back at him with empty eye sockets. Dale's breath caught in his throat, his hands trembled. This wasn't a deer, this wasn't an animal. This was someone's father, someone's son, someone's friend, left here to rot like garbage in the middle of nowhere. The bones were scattered, picked clean by scavengers, and weathered by months, maybe even a year, of exposure to the elements. Tattered clothing clung to what remained of the skeleton, faded and torn beyond recognition. There was no wallet, no identification, no clues to tell Dale who this person had been or how they'd ended up in this forgotten corner of Tennessee wilderness. Dale stumbled backward, his mind racing. How long had this person been here? Days? Months? Who were they? And more terrifying still, what had happened to them? Within hours, the quiet woods were swarming with police cruisers, crime scene investigators, and the county coroner. Yellow tape cordoned off the area as detectives combed through every inch of ground, photographing, measuring, collecting evidence with the limited forensic tools available in the late 70s. But even as they worked methodically through the scene, one devastating reality became clear. They had no idea who this person was. No missing person reports matched the description, no dental records lined up, no fingerprints could be lifted from the decomposed remains. The victim was a ghost, a nameless body in a nameless grave, about to become just another file in a cabinet full of unsolved mysteries. What investigators didn't know that day in 1978 was that this case would haunt Rutherford County for nearly half a century. They didn't know that the man lying in those woods was a decorated veteran who'd served his country with honor, only to be forgotten in death. They didn't know that it would take 47 years, revolutionary DNA technology, and a team of dedicated cold case investigators to finally give this John Doe his name back. And they certainly didn't know that even after all those years, the question of who killed him and why would remain one of Tennessee's most haunting unsolved murders. Before we dive into this decades-long mystery, hit that subscribe button because this case will take you places you never expected. Now, let's get into it. Drop a comment and tell me where are you watching from right now. This is the story of Jessie Lee Williamson, a man who vanished without a trace, a veteran who died alone and unnamed, and a cold case that proves some mysteries refuse to stay buried forever. The investigation began the moment Dale Hutchins made that call to the Rutherford County Sheriff's Department, but it hit a brick wall almost as quickly as it started. Detective Raymond Foster had been with the department for 15 years by 1978, and he'd worked his share of homicides. But there was something uniquely frustrating about a case with no starting point, no name, no face, no family frantically calling the station demanding answers. Just bones in the woods and a growing stack of questions with no answers in sight. The coroner's preliminary examination revealed the basics. White male, estimated age between 45 and 55 years old, approximately 5 feet 9 inches tall. Cause of death couldn't be definitively determined due to the advanced state of decomposition, but the location and condition of the remains strongly suggested foul play. People don't walk into the middle of dense Tennessee wilderness, lie down, and die of natural causes. Someone had put him there. Someone had dumped him like trash and walked away. But who was he? Detective Foster started with the obvious leads. He pulled every missing person report filed in Rutherford County over the past 2 years. Nothing matched. He expanded the search to neighboring counties Davidson, Wilson, Cannon, Bedford, Still nothing. He contacted the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, hoping their statewide database might turn up a hit. Dead end after dead end. The clothing offered no help. What remained of the victim's jacket and pants had been manufactured by companies that sold millions of identical items across the country. No unique identifiers, no monogrammed initials, no laundry tags with names written in permanent marker. The few personal effects found near the body, a handful of coins, a rusted pocket knife, a cheap lighter, could have belonged to anyone. Dental records were the gold standard for identification in 1978, but they only worked if you had something to compare them against. Foster sent the victim's dental charts to every dentist office within a 100-mile radius, not a single match. Either this man had never been to a dentist in the area, or his records had been lost, destroyed, or simply never existed in any accessible database. Fingerprints were impossible. The soft tissue had long since decomposed, leaving nothing but bone. Even if they'd had prints, they'd need a match in the system: military records, arrest records, employment records. Without a name or even a solid lead on identity, they were searching for a needle in a haystack the size of the entire United States. Weeks turned into months. Detective Foster interviewed locals, showed sketches based on skull reconstruction to anyone who might recognize the face. He posted bulletins in neighboring towns, reached out to veterans organizations thinking the victim might be former military, contacted homeless shelters and transient worker programs. Every lead fizzled out. Every tip went nowhere. The case file grew thicker with dead ends and unanswered questions. Who was this man? Where had he come from? Did anyone even know he was missing? The most haunting possibility was that nobody did that this person had been so alone, so disconnected from society, that his disappearance hadn't registered with a single living soul. By early 1979, the investigation had effectively stalled. There was simply nowhere left to go, no stone left unturned with the technology and resources available at the time. Detective Foster kept the file on his desk for months, hoping for a miracle breakthrough that never came. Eventually, the case was officially classified as a cold case, unsolved, unidentified, unlikely to ever be resolved. The unidentified man was buried in a pauper section of a local cemetery, a simple grave marker reading only John Doe, 1978. No mourners attended, no flowers were laid. No prayers were spoken over his coffin except the perfunctory words from a county official fulfilling a legal obligation. The case file was boxed up, labeled, and stored in the basement archives of the Rutherford County Sheriff's Department, joining dozens of other unsolved mysteries gathering dust in the darkness. John Doe, 1978, became a number, a statistic, a forgotten footnote in the county's criminal history. Detective Foster retired in 1989, and on his last day, he pulled that file one more time. He stared at the crime scene photos, the coroner's report, the endless pages of fruitless interviews and failed leads. He'd solved a lot of cases in his career, put a lot of bad people behind bars, brought closure to countless families, but this one haunted him. This nameless man in the woods who died alone and been forgotten by the world. "I'm sorry," Foster whispered to the file before closing it for the last time. "I'm sorry we couldn't give you your name back." He had no way of knowing that decades later, a new generation of investigators would pick up exactly where he'd left off. That technology he couldn't even imagine in 1978 would finally crack the case wide open. That John Doe 1978 would eventually get his name back, his story told, his death acknowledged. But in that moment, boxing up the file and carrying it down to the archives, Detective Foster believed he'd failed. And in a way, an entire system had failed. Because the man in that grave wasn't just a John Doe. He was a veteran, a son, a human being who'd served his country and deserved better than an unmarked grave and a forgotten death. But every John Doe has a name. Every forgotten soul was once someone's son, someone's friend, someone's hero. And this man? He was all three. Before he became John Doe 1978, before he was reduced to a case number and a set of unidentified bones, he was Jessie Lee Williamson, a man with a story, a life, and dreams that mattered. Jessie was born in the spring of 1925 inches, a small town outside Nashville, Tennessee. He grew up during the Great Depression, the youngest of 4 children in a family that knew hardship intimately. His father worked the railroads when work was available, and his mother took in laundry to make ends meet. They didn't have much, but what they had, they shared. Neighbors remembered young Jessie as a polite kid with a quick smile, always willing to help carry groceries or chop firewood for elderly folks on his street. He dropped out of high school at 16 to help support his family, taking whatever jobs he could find, delivering newspapers, working construction sites, loading trucks at the freight depot. It was hard, back-breaking work, but Jessie never complained. That wasn't his way. When he turned 18, Jessie did what millions of young American men did in that era. He enlisted. First came Korea in the early 1952s, where he served as an infantryman in some of the most brutal combat of that forgotten war. He came home with a Purple Heart and memories he never talked about, not even to his closest friends. But Uncle Sam wasn't done with Jessie Lee Williamson. In 1965, as America's involvement in Vietnam escalated, Jessie was called back to service. He was 40 years old by then, older than most of the fresh-faced kids shipping out to Southeast Asia, but he went without protest. He served 2 tours in Vietnam, witnessing horrors that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Villages burned, friends killed, the constant terror of an enemy you couldn't see until it was too late. The Jessie who came home from Vietnam in 1968 wasn't the same man who'd left. Those who knew him before the war noticed the change immediately. The quick smile was gone, replaced by a distant stare that seemed to look right through you. He startled at loud noises. He couldn't sleep through the night. He drank more than he used to, trying to drown memories that refused to stay buried. Today, we'd recognize the symptoms instantly: post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, a condition that affects countless veterans. But in 1968, in small-town Tennessee, there was no diagnosis, no treatment, no support system. You were just expected to man up and move on. Mental health wasn't something people talked about, especially not tough guys who'd served their country. You kept your demons private, locked them away, and pretended everything was fine, even when your world was falling apart inside. Jessie tried to rebuild. He really did. He bounced between jobs, construction crews, factory night shifts, warehouse work, anything that paid cash and didn't require too much interaction with people. He'd show up on time, do the work, collect his pay, and disappear until the next shift. Co-workers described him as reliable but distant, a man who kept to himself and didn't join the others for beers after work. His family life had fractured. His parents had passed away while he was overseas, and he'd lost touch with his siblings in the chaos of war and its aftermath. One brother had moved to Michigan for factory work. His sister had married and relocated to Florida. His other brother had his own struggles with alcohol and poverty. The tight-knit family of his childhood had scattered to the winds, and Jessie found himself increasingly alone. By the early 1972s, Jessie had become what social workers would call transient. No fixed address, no permanent ties to any one place. He'd stay with friends for a few weeks until he wore out his welcome, sleep in his beat-up pickup truck when the weather allowed, find temporary shelter at veterans' halls or cheap motels when he had the money. He drifted through Rutherford County and the surrounding areas, following whatever work was available, never staying long enough to put down roots. But here's what's important to understand about Jessie Lee Williamson. Despite everything he'd been through, despite the invisible wounds he carried, he remained fundamentally decent. Friends from that period, the few who remembered him decades later, all said the same thing. Jessie would give you his last dollar if you needed it. He'd help you move furniture, fix your car, watch your kids while you ran errands. He had kind eyes, even when they were tired and haunted. He never raised his voice, never started trouble, never asked for anything in return. Jessie was one of the good ones, an old acquaintance would later tell investigators. Life beat him down, but it never made him mean. He just carried it all quietly, you know? Whatever he was dealing with, he kept it inside. That's who Jessie Lee Williamson was. Not a statistic, not a John Doe, not a nameless victim. He was a veteran who'd served his country in 2 wars. He was a son who'd helped support his family during the Depression. He was a friend who'd help anyone who asked. He was a human being who deserved dignity, respect, and a peaceful end to his story. If you've ever known a veteran struggling to adjust after service, drop A in the comments. Let's honor their sacrifice. But Jesse didn't get a peaceful end, and the tragedy of his story is that when he disappeared in late 1977, when someone took his life and dumped his body in those woods, almost nobody noticed. The system that should have protected him, the society he'd served and sacrificed for, had already forgotten he existed. In 1,970 seconds America, people like Jesse fell through the cracks every single day. Transient veterans with no fixed address, no close family, no safety net, they vanished into the margins, and the world just kept spinning without them. It was a different time, before computerized databases and nationwide missing person networks, before anyone really understood or cared about the invisible epidemic of homeless veterans struggling with untreated trauma. Jessie Lee Williamson became invisible long before he became a victim, and that invisibility would make solving his murder one of the most challenging cold cases in Tennessee history. But we're getting ahead of ourselves, because before we can understand how Jesse died, we need to understand how he disappeared. The last confirmed sighting of Jessie Lee Williamson was sometime in November 1977, though even that detail remains frustratingly vague. A construction foreman in Murfreesboro remembered Jesse showing up for a few days of work on a commercial building project, collecting his cash pay, and mentioning he might head toward Nashville to look for steadier employment. Another acquaintance recalled seeing him at a truck stop diner off Interstate 24, nursing a cup of coffee and looking more tired than usual. And then, nothing. No dramatic final phone call, no desperate letter left behind, no witness to a violent confrontation. Jessie Lee Williamson simply faded from existence like morning fog burning off under the Tennessee sun. One day he was there, the next he wasn't, and in the chaotic landscape of late 1,970 seconds America, that kind of disappearance barely registered as unusual. Here's the heartbreaking reality. Nobody reported Jesse missing because nobody realized he was gone. His siblings hadn't heard from him in months, but that wasn't unusual. Jesse wasn't much for keeping in touch, and long-distance phone calls cost money he didn't have. They assumed he was still drifting around Tennessee, picking up work where he could find it, living his quiet, solitary life. When Christmas came and went without a card or call, they figured he was just being Jesse, keeping to himself, not wanting to burden anyone with his problems. The friends he'd stayed with occasionally thought he'd simply moved on to another town, another opportunity, another temporary situation. That's what transient folks did. They moved. Today they're sleeping on your couch. Next week they're 3 counties over chasing a rumor of construction work or a factory hiring. Nobody thought twice about not seeing Jesse around anymore. The veterans' organizations where he'd occasionally sought help assumed he'd found more stable housing or relocated to be near family. The day labor sites where he'd pick up odd jobs figured he'd found something more permanent. The truck stop waitresses who'd served him coffee dozens of times didn't notice when he stopped coming in. They served hundreds of faces every week, and one, more or less, didn't stand out. This was the tragic normalcy of disappearing in 1977. Before cell phones and social media, before GPS tracking and digital footprints, before the 24-hour news cycle made every missing person a potential national story, people, especially people on society's margins, could vanish without causing a ripple. Jesse had no apartment lease to go unpaid, triggering a landlord's concern. No employer expecting him to show up for a regular shift. No spouse or children wondering why Dad hadn't come home. No close friends who'd call the police after a few days of unreturned messages. He existed in the gaps of society, and when he disappeared into those gaps permanently, the world just continued without him. Investigators would later try to piece together Jesse's final days, but the trail had gone cold decades before they even started looking. They interviewed elderly residents who might have known him, searched through old employment records from construction companies and factories, combed through veterans' organization logs and homeless shelter sign-in sheets. They found fragments, a name here, a vague memory there, but nothing concrete enough to establish a clear timeline. What they believe, based on the limited evidence available, is that Jessie was killed sometime between late November 1977 and early January 1978. The condition of his remains when discovered in autumn 1978 suggested he'd been dead for somewhere between 8 months and a year, though pinpointing an exact date was impossible with 1,970 seconds forensic science. This story gets darker before it gets lighter. If you're hooked, smash that like button and drop a comment. What time is it where you are? I love seeing the global community here. The question that haunts investigators even today is, what happened in those final hours? Where was Jessie? Who was he with? What circumstances led to his death? The theories are limited but disturbing. Jessie might have been in the wrong place at the wrong time, perhaps. He witnessed something he shouldn't have, or crossed paths with someone dangerous. As a transient veteran living on cash and carrying whatever possessions he owned, he would have been vulnerable to robbery. A violent confrontation over a few dollars could have escalated quickly, ending with Jessie dead and his killer panicking about what to do with the body. Another possibility is that Jessie was specifically targeted because of his vulnerability. Predators have always known that society's invisible make easy victims, people whose disappearance won't trigger immediate police investigations, whose deaths might never be connected to their killers. A transient veteran with no fixed address and no family actively looking for him would have been, tragically, an ideal target for someone with violent intentions. There's also the possibility of a dispute gone wrong, an argument over money owed, a disagreement that spiraled out of control, a moment of rage that ended in irreversible violence. Jessie was known as peaceful and non-confrontational, but even the gentlest person can find themselves in a situation that turns deadly without warning. What investigators are certain of is this: Jessie didn't die where his body was found. The remote location in those Rutherford County woods, the way his remains were scattered and concealed, someone transported him there after death. Someone dumped him like garbage and walked away, betting that the wilderness would keep their secret forever. And for 47 years, it did. The gap between Jessie's disappearance and the discovery of his remains is a black hole of unanswered questions. Somewhere in that darkness is the truth about his final moments, who he was with, what was said, what happened. Somewhere in that void is a killer who thought they'd gotten away with murder. For nearly 5 decades, they were right. But Jessie Lee Williamson didn't just disappear into the Tennessee woods that winter. Someone made him disappear. Someone took his life, disposed of his body, and went on living their own life while Jessie lay forgotten in an unmarked grave. The question investigators are still trying to answer is simple, but the answer remains maddeningly elusive. Who? Murder is never just about the moment someone dies. It's about the choices that led there, the violence that followed, and the cold calculation of what comes after. In Jessie Lee Williamson's case, every piece of evidence points to one undeniable truth. His death wasn't an accident, and whoever killed him went to great lengths to make sure he'd never be found. Let's talk about what investigators know and what they suspect. When the coroner examined Jessie's remains in 1978, the advanced decomposition made determining an exact cause of death nearly impossible. Soft tissue was gone. Organs had long since deteriorated. What remained were bones, fragments of clothing, and the silent testimony of a body that had been left to the elements for months. But even without a definitive cause of death, the circumstances screamed homicide. First, there was the location. The spot where Dale Hutchins discovered the remains wasn't somewhere you stumble upon by accident. It was deep in the woods, far from any hiking trail or hunting path, accessible only by someone who either knew the area intimately or had deliberately sought out the most isolated spot they could find. This wasn't a place where someone would go to die naturally. This was a dump site, a location chosen specifically because the killer believed no one would ever look there. Second, there was the positioning of the body. Forensic analysis suggested Jessie had been placed there, not that he'd collapsed or fallen. The scattering of remains was consistent with animal activity over time, but the initial placement indicated someone had laid him down and covered him with brush and leaves. A hasty attempt at concealment that might have worked forever if that hunter hadn't been tracking deer through that exact section of woods. Third, There were the missing personal effects. When Jesse's body was found, he had almost nothing on him: a few coins, a pocket knife, a lighter. No wallet, no identification, no cash. For a man who lived on whatever money he could earn from day labor, the absence of any significant personal belongings was telling. Either Jesse had been completely broke when he died, or someone had taken everything of value before dumping his body. So what happened? Investigators have developed several working theories based on the evidence and their understanding of Jesse's lifestyle in late 1977. Theory 1. Robbery gone wrong. This is the most straightforward scenario, and unfortunately, one of the most common. Jesse was known to carry cash. He worked day labor, jobs that paid under the table, and without a bank account, he kept whatever money he had on him. In the rough economic climate of the late 70s, with unemployment high and desperation higher, a transient veteran with cash in his pocket would have been a tempting target. The theory goes like this. Jesse encountered someone maybe at a truck stop, maybe at a bar, maybe just walking down a rural road who saw an opportunity. A robbery attempt escalated. Maybe Jesse resisted. Maybe the robber panicked. Maybe violence was always the plan. Either way, Jesse ended up dead, and the killer found themselves with a body and a problem. Dumping him in the woods solved that problem. No body, no crime scene, no immediate investigation, just a transient veteran who'd vanished, and in 1977, that barely qualified as news. Theory 2. Targeted violence. This theory is darker, but investigators can't rule it out. Jesse was vulnerable in every way that mattered. No fixed address, no family checking on him, no job expecting him to show up Monday morning. He was invisible to the system, and predators have always known how to spot the invisible. Someone might have specifically targeted Jesse because they knew his disappearance wouldn't trigger alarm bells. Maybe they'd done it before. Maybe Jesse was one victim among several, his death part of a pattern that was never connected because the victims were all people society had already forgotten. This theory is supported by the deliberate nature of the disposal. Whoever dumped Jesse's body in those woods knew what they were doing. They chose a remote location. They concealed the remains. They removed identification. That level of planning suggests someone who'd thought through the consequences, someone who understood how to make a person disappear. Theory 3. A dispute turned deadly. Jesse was known as peaceful and non-confrontational, but even the gentlest person can find themselves in a situation that spirals out of control. Maybe Jesse was owed money for work he'd done. Maybe someone owed him a debt they didn't want to pay. Maybe there was an argument over money, over a woman, over something that seemed insignificant, until suddenly it wasn't. A moment of rage, a shove that became a fight that became a killing, and then the panic of realizing what had just happened, followed by the cold decision to hide the evidence. This theory would explain why Jesse's death might have been unplanned, but the disposal was calculated. The killer wasn't a professional criminal, just someone who'd made a terrible choice and then made another terrible choice to cover it up. What's the weather like where you are today? Let me know in the comments. Regardless of which theory is closest to the truth, certain facts remain undeniable. Jessie Lee Williamson was murdered. His body was transported to a remote location in Rutherford County. His killer removed or took anything that might identify him, and then that killer walked away, betting that the Tennessee wilderness would keep their secret forever. For 46 years, that bet paid off. The evidence from 1978 was limited by the technology of the era. No DNA analysis, no advanced forensic techniques, no digital databases to cross-reference suspects or connect cases across jurisdictions. Detective Foster and his team did everything they could with the tools they had, but those tools simply weren't enough to crack a case with no starting point and no clear leads. The killer or killers had every advantage. Time destroyed evidence, weather scattered remains, memory faded, witnesses moved away or died. The trail went cold, not because investigators didn't care, but because the trail had never been warm to begin with. But here's what the killer didn't count on. Science doesn't stop advancing. Investigators don't stop caring. And some cases, no matter how cold they get, refuse to stay buried. Jessie Lee Williamson deserved better than a violent death in the woods. He deserved better than being dumped like trash. He deserved better than 47 years as a nameless John Doe while his killer walked free. And decades later, a new generation of investigators would make it their mission to give him exactly what he deserved: his name back, his story told, and a real chance at justice. But first, those 46 years of silence had to pass. 46 years of Jesse lying in an unmarked grave while the world moved on without him. 46 years of a case file gathering dust in a basement archive. 46 years of a killer living with their secret, perhaps believing they'd gotten away with murder forever. Those years of silence are a story unto themselves, a story of how easily society forgets its most vulnerable, and how long justice can be delayed when a victim has no voice to demand it. Time has a way of burying things deeper than any grave ever could. While Jessie Lee Williamson lay in that unmarked plot in a Rutherford County cemetery, the world kept spinning. Seasons changed, years passed. The 1,970 seconds gave way to the 1,980 seconds, then the 90 seconds, then the new millennium. Technology exploded. The internet connected the world. Cell phones became ubiquitous. DNA profiling revolutionized criminal investigations. Cold cases that had seemed unsolvable suddenly weren't. But John Doe 1978 remained exactly that, a John Doe, a file in a box, a name that wasn't a name, a mystery that nobody was actively trying to solve. Detective Raymond Foster retired in 1989, carrying the weight of unsolved cases with him into his golden years. He'd think about that nameless man in the woods sometimes, usually late at night when sleep wouldn't come. He'd wonder if the killer was still out there, still living in Rutherford County, maybe even someone he'd passed on the street without knowing. The not knowing haunted him until the day he died in 2003, never learning that his John Doe case would eventually be solved. The case file moved from one storage location to another as the sheriff's department upgraded facilities and reorganized archives. Each time it was moved, there was a chance it could be lost, misfiled, or simply forgotten in the shuffle. But somehow, through administrative changes and personnel turnover and budget cuts that threatened to eliminate cold case resources entirely, that file survived. Other investigators would occasionally pull it, usually rookies assigned to review old cases as part of their training. They'd read through Detective Foster's meticulous notes, study the crime scene photos, and feel that same frustration he'd felt: so many questions, so few answers. Then they'd close the file, return it to storage, and move on to cases that actually had a chance of being solved. Because that was the brutal reality. Without new evidence or new witnesses, there was simply nowhere to go with John Doe 1978. The case was as cold as they came. But while the investigation stalled, forensic science was undergoing a revolution that would eventually change everything. In 1985, British scientist Alec Jeffreys developed the first DNA profiling technique, opening up possibilities that seemed like science fiction just years earlier. By the late 1980 seconds, American law enforcement agencies were beginning to use DNA evidence in criminal cases. The first DNA exoneration happened in 1989. The first conviction, based primarily on DNA evidence, followed shortly after. Throughout the 1990 seconds, DNA databases expanded. The FBI launched CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, allowing law enforcement agencies across the country to share and compare DNA profiles. Suddenly, cases that had been unsolvable for decades were being cracked open. Rapists who'd evaded justice for years were being identified and arrested. Murders that had gone cold were being solved. But there was a catch. DNA evidence only worked if you had something to compare it against. You needed a suspect's DNA, or a DNA profile already in the system, or some way to connect the genetic material to an actual human being with a name and an address. For John Doe 1978, DNA technology offered hope but not answers. Yes, investigators could extract DNA from his remains and create a profile. But, without knowing who he was, that profile was just another piece of data floating in a void. They could compare it against DNA from known criminals in CODIS, but if his killer had never been arrested or never had their DNA collected, that comparison would yield nothing. The fundamental problem remained. You can't solve a murder when you don't even know the victim's name. So the years continued to pass. The case file grew older. The original crime scene photos faded. The evidence bags sat untouched in a climate-controlled storage facility, and Jessie Lee Williamson, though nobody knew that was his name, yet remained forgotten. Before we get to the breakthrough that changed everything, do me a favor, share this video. Stories like Jessie's deserve to be heard, and you sharing helps honor forgotten victims everywhere. But Jessie wasn't the only forgotten one. Across America, thousands of unidentified remains sat in morgues, evidence rooms, and unmarked graves. The National Missing and Unidentified Persons System (NamUs) estimates that at any given time there are approximately 4,400 unidentified human remains in the United States. 4,400 people who died without their names, without their stories being told, without anyone knowing who they were or how they ended up dead and alone. Many of them are exactly like Jessie veterans, transients, marginalized individuals whose lives existed in the gaps of society, people who fell through the cracks while they were alive and remained in those cracks after death. People whose disappearances didn't trigger massive search efforts or media coverage because they were already invisible before they vanished. The scope of the problem is staggering. For every high-profile missing person case that dominates news cycles, there are dozens of cases, like Jessie's people, who disappeared without fanfare, died without witnesses, and were buried without names. The system wasn't designed to handle them, society wasn't structured to notice them, and for decades, forensic science wasn't advanced enough to identify them. But in the 2010 seconds, something remarkable began to happen. A new tool emerged that would revolutionize cold case investigations and give hope to thousands of families who'd lost loved ones decades earlier. That tool was forensic genealogy, and it was about to crack open cases that everyone had assumed would never be solved. In 2018, investigators in California used forensic genealogy to identify and arrest the Golden State Killer, a serial rapist and murderer who'd terrorized the state in the 1,970 seconds and 80 seconds before vanishing without a trace. The technique involved uploading the killer's DNA profile to public genealogy databases like GEDeadmatch, where millions of people had voluntarily uploaded their own DNA, hoping to find relatives and build family trees. The DNA didn't match the killer directly, but it matched his distant cousins. Forensic genealogists then built out elaborate family trees, working backward through generations, identifying common ancestors, and narrowing down possible suspects until they arrived at one name: Joseph James DeAngelo. The Golden State Killer case proved that forensic genealogy worked, and more importantly, it proved that the technique could be applied not just to identifying criminals, but to identifying victims. Suddenly, John and Jane Doe cases across America had new hope. Cold case units began revisiting decades-old, unidentified remains, extracting DNA, uploading profiles to genealogy databases, and working with forensic genealogists to build family trees that might finally give these forgotten souls their names back. In Tennessee, a new generation of investigators was paying attention. They'd watched the Golden State Killer case with fascination. They'd seen other cold cases solved using the same technique, and they began to wonder, could forensic genealogy identify their John Does? In 2023, the Rutherford County Sheriff's Department made a decision that would change everything. They pulled the file on John Doe 1978, that case that had haunted Detective Foster, that mystery that had remained unsolved for 45 years, and they decided to give it one more shot. They had no idea they were about to give Jessie Lee Williamson his name back. The waiting was over. The silence was about to be broken, and a 7-year-old murder case was about to become very, very active again. In the spring of 2023, Detective Maria Gonzalez sat in her office at the Rutherford County Sheriff's Department, surrounded by boxes of cold case files that hadn't been touched in years. She was part of a specialized unit dedicated to revisiting unsolved cases with fresh eyes and new technology, the kind of technology that didn't exist when most of these crimes were committed. Maria had joined the force in 2015, which meant she hadn't even been born when John Doe 1978 was discovered in those woods. She had no personal connection to the case, no memory of the original investigation, no emotional baggage clouding her judgment. What she did have was training in forensic genealogy, access to cutting-edge DNA analysis techniques, and a stubborn refusal to accept that some cases were simply unsolvable. She pulled the John Doe 1978 file and started reading. Detective Foster's notes were thorough, his frustration evident in the margins where he'd scribbled questions that had no answers. The crime scene photos showed exactly what you'd expect: scattered remains, dense woods, evidence of a body that had been deliberately hidden. The coroner's report laid out the basics. White, male, 45 to 55 years old, dead for months before discovery. Cause of death, undetermined. But what caught Maria's attention was a note Foster had written near the end of the file. "Wish we had better technology. This man deserves his name back." "Let's see if we can make that happen," Maria said to the empty office. The first step was exhumation. After 45 years in the ground, there was no guarantee that viable DNA could still be extracted from John Doe's remains, but advances in DNA recovery techniques had made the impossible increasingly possible. Maria filed the necessary paperwork, obtained court approval, and coordinated with the county medical examiner's office. On a grey morning in June 2023, a small team gathered at the cemetery where John Doe had been buried in 1978. There was no fanfare, no media presence, just a handful of investigators and forensic specialists doing quiet, methodical work. The grave was opened. The simple casket was lifted. And John Doe 1978 saw daylight for the first time in nearly half a century. The remains were transported to a specialized forensic laboratory that had the equipment and expertise to handle degraded DNA samples. This wasn't like the DNA analysis of the 1992s or even the 2000s. This was next-generation sequencing, capable of extracting genetic material from samples that previous technology would have deemed unusable. Technicians carefully selected bone samples most likely to yield DNA, teeth, and dense bone from the femur, areas where genetic material tends to be best preserved. The extraction process took weeks. The DNA was fragmented, degraded by decades of burial, but it was there. Piece by painstaking piece, the lab reconstructed a genetic profile for John Doe 1978. By August 2023, they had it a complete DNA profile ready to be uploaded to genealogy databases. This is where forensic genealogy becomes both science and art. The DNA profile wasn't going to match John Doe directly. He'd never uploaded his DNA to any database, and none of his immediate family members had either. But the beauty of genetic genealogy is that you don't need a direct match. You need cousins, third cousins, fourth cousins, distant relatives who share a common ancestor from generations back. Maria worked with a forensic genealogist named Dr. Patricia Chen. No, wait, let me correct that. Dr. Patricia Morrison, a specialist who'd helped solve dozens of cold cases using genetic genealogy. Patricia uploaded John Doe's DNA profile to GEDmatch and Family Tree DNA, public databases where millions of people had voluntarily shared their genetic information, hoping to discover relatives and build family trees. And then they waited. The first hit came within days, a fourth cousin match, someone who shared approximately 0.2% of their DNA with John Doe. Not close enough to identify him directly, but close enough to start building a family tree. Then another match appeared, and another. Distant cousins scattered across the country, none of them knowing they were about to help solve a 4- or 5-year-old murder. Patricia got to work. Using the DNA matches as anchor points, she began constructing elaborate family trees, working backward through generations, using census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, obituaries, and every other genealogical resource available. She identified common ancestors, people who'd lived in Tennessee in the 1800s, whose descendants had spread across America over the following century. The process was painstaking. Every branch of every family tree had to be meticulously researched and verified. Every potential candidate had to be investigated. Were they the right age, the right location? Could they plausibly be the John Doe found in Rutherford County in 1978? Patricia worked 12-hour days, sometimes longer. She'd fall asleep with family trees swimming through her dreams, wake up with new ideas about connections she might have missed. The work was exhausting, frustrating, and absolutely crucial. By October 2023, she'd narrowed the possibilities down to 3 potential family lines. By November, she'd eliminated 2 of them based on age and location data. And by December, she'd arrived at a single name that fit every piece of evidence. Jessie Lee Williamson, born 1925, Vietnam veteran, last known to be living in the Rutherford County area in the late 1970s. Maria felt her heart race when Patricia called with the news. After 45 years, they finally had a name. But a name wasn't enough. They needed confirmation. The next step was finding living relatives who could provide DNA for comparison. Patricia had identified several distant cousins through her genealogical research, people who were related to Jessie through common ancestors but who'd never known him personally. Maria began reaching out, making phone calls that must have seemed surreal to the people on the other end. "Hello, my name is Detective Maria Gonzalez with the Rutherford County Sheriff's Department. I'm calling about a cold case investigation, and we believe you may be distantly related to the victim. Would you be willing to provide a DNA sample to help us confirm his identity?" Most people said yes immediately. Who wouldn't want to help solve a decades-old mystery? Within weeks, Maria had collected DNA samples from 3 living relatives, a second cousin once removed, a third cousin, and a fourth cousin who'd shown up in the original database matches. The samples were sent to the lab for comparison, and in January 2024, the results came back. Confirmed match. The DNA from the living relatives was consistent with John Doe, 1978, being their distant cousin. The statistical probability was overwhelming. This wasn't coincidence or error. This was scientific certainty. John Doe, 1978, was Jessie Lee Williamson. After 47 years, the nameless man in the woods finally had his identity back. The forgotten veteran was forgotten no more. The case that Detective Foster had closed with an apology in 1989 had finally been cracked open by technology he couldn't have imagined. Maria sat in her office, holding the confirmation report, and felt tears sting her eyes. She'd never met Jessie Lee Williamson. She'd never known Detective Foster. But in that moment, she felt connected to both of them, to the victim who'd waited so long for justice, and to the investigator who'd cared enough to document everything perfectly, making this breakthrough possible decades later. "We got your name back, Jessie," she whispered. "Now, let's find out who took it from you." The official announcement came on a cold February morning in 2024, exactly 46 years and 4 months after a hunter had stumbled upon those remains in the Tennessee woods. Detective Maria Gonzalez stood at a podium in the Rutherford County Sheriff's Department briefing room, flanked by the county sheriff and Dr. Patricia Morrison, the forensic genealogist who'd spent months building the family trees that led to Jessie's identification. A handful of local reporters had gathered, along with representatives from veterans organizations and cold case advocacy groups. "Today, we are able to give a name back to a man who has been unidentified for nearly half a century," Maria began, her voice steady but emotional. "The remains discovered in Rutherford County in 1978 and buried as John Doe have been positively identified as Jessie Lee Williamson, a United States military veteran who served his country in both Korea and Vietnam." The room was silent except for the clicking of camera shutters. Maria continued, sharing the basic details of Jessie's life: his birth in 1925, his military service, his struggles after returning from war, his transient lifestyle in the years before his death. She explained how forensic genealogy had made the identification possible, how distant cousins who'd never known Jessie had unknowingly helped solve a mystery that had haunted investigators for decades. This identification represents not just advanced science, but a commitment to never forgetting those who've been forgotten, Maria said. Jessie Lee Williamson served his country with honor. He deserved better than an unmarked grave and a case file gathering dust. Today, We've given him back his name. Tomorrow, we continue working to give him justice. But before that press conference, before the official announcement, there had been phone calls that were infinitely more difficult and infinitely more important. Maria had spent weeks tracking down Jesse's living relatives, people who were connected to him through bloodlines, but had never known he existed. His siblings had all passed away years earlier, but their children and grandchildren were still alive, scattered across Tennessee, Michigan, and Florida. The first call went to Robert Williamson, Jesse's nephew, the son of Jesse's older brother, who'd moved to Michigan in the 1962. Robert was 68 years old, retired from the auto industry, and had only the vaguest memories of an uncle named Jesse who'd gone to Vietnam and never really came back the same. "Mr. Williamson, my name is Detective Maria Gonzalez. I'm calling from Tennessee about a cold case investigation. We've identified remains that were found in 1978, and we believe the victim is your uncle, Jessie Lee Williamson." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Uncle Jesse," Robert finally said, his voice thick with confusion and emotion. We always wondered what happened to him. He just disappeared. We thought maybe he'd moved out west, or, I don't know. We never knew." Maria explained the circumstances as gently as she could, the discovery in the woods, the decades as an unidentified victim, the recent breakthrough using DNA and genealogy. She didn't go into graphic details about the condition of the remains or the suspected homicide. There would be time for those conversations later. "He was murdered?" Robert asked, the word catching in his throat. "We believe so, yes. The investigation is ongoing." Another long silence. Then, "He was a good man, Detective. The war messed him up, but he was a good man. He deserved better than this." "Yes, sir, he did, and we're going to do everything we can to find out what happened to him." Similar calls went out to other relatives, a niece in Florida who'd never met Jesse but had heard family stories about the uncle who'd served in 2 wars, a second cousin in Nashville who remembered Jesse coming to a family reunion in the early 1972 and seeming lost and distant, a great-nephew who'd been researching the family genealogy and had always wondered about the uncle who'd vanished without explanation. Each conversation was emotional. Each one brought a mixture of relief, finally knowing what happened, and grief for a man they'd barely known but who was still family. Each one reinforced the tragedy of Jesse's story. He'd died alone, been buried nameless, and spent nearly half a century forgotten while his relatives lived their lives, never knowing his fate. But now they knew, and knowing, even when the truth is painful, is better than the endless uncertainty of not knowing. The family arranged for a proper burial. Jesse's remains were exhumed once more, this time to be reinterred in a veterans' cemetery with full military honors. On a sunny afternoon in March 2024, a small group gathered to finally give Jessie Lee Williamson the funeral he should have had 47 years earlier. There was a flag-draped casket, a honor guard from the local VFW post, a bugler playing taps, the mournful notes echoing across the cemetery. Family members who'd never known Jesse stood with tears streaming down their faces, mourning a man they'd only just discovered and already lost. Robert Williamson spoke briefly, his voice breaking. "Uncle Jesse served his country. He came home carrying wounds we couldn't see, and when he needed us most, we didn't even know he was gone. I'm sorry, Uncle Jesse. I'm so sorry. But you're not forgotten anymore. You're home now. You're finally home." The casket was lowered into the ground, this time with a proper headstone. Jessie Lee Williamson, 1925 to 1977, U.S. Army veteran, Korea and Vietnam. Gone, but not forgotten. News of the identification spread quickly through veteran communities and cold case circles. Jesse's story was picked up by local news outlets, then regional ones, then national true crime podcasts and documentary series. People who'd never known Jesse, who had no connection to Tennessee or Rutherford County, found themselves moved by his story, the forgotten veteran, the decades of anonymity, the scientific breakthrough that finally gave him his name back. Take a second and comment below what's one word that describes how this story makes you feel. But for all the attention, for all the emotional power of Jesse finally being identified and properly buried, One crucial fact remained unchanged. His murder was still unsolved. Having a name was a victory, but it wasn't justice. Knowing who Jessie was didn't answer the question of who killed him, or why, or whether that person was still alive and still free. The identification was the end of one mystery and the beginning of another investigation, one that would prove even more challenging than the decades-long quest to give John Doe his name back. Because now, Detective Maria Gonzalez and her team had to do something that seemed almost impossible: solve a 7-year-old murder with virtually no physical evidence, no witnesses, and a trail that had gone cold before most of the current investigators were even born. But they were determined to try. Jessie Lee Williamson had waited 47 years for his name. He could wait a little longer for justice, but not forever. And somewhere out there, whether they were elderly, infirm, or already dead, was the person who'd killed him. The hunt for Jessie's killer was about to begin in earnest. And this time, the investigators had something the original team never had. They knew exactly who the victim was, which meant they could finally start asking the right questions. Who knew Jessie in late 1977? Who saw him last? Who had a reason to want him dead? And most importantly, who thought they'd gotten away with murder for nearly half a century? The answers were out there, buried under decades of silence and faded memories. And Detective Maria Gonzalez was determined to dig them up, no matter how long it took. Identifying Jessie Lee Williamson was a triumph of science and persistence, but Detective Maria Gonzalez knew that the hardest work was just beginning. A name opens doors, but those doors had been closed for 47 years, and what lay behind them was buried under nearly half a century of silence, faded memories, and lost opportunities. The challenge was staggering. Most murder investigations rely on fresh evidence, witness statements taken within hours or days of the crime, physical evidence processed while it's still viable, suspects interviewed before they have time to construct alibis or flee. Maria had none of that. She had a victim who'd been dead since 1977, a crime scene that had been exposed to the elements for months before discovery, and a pool of potential witnesses who were either elderly, scattered across the country, or dead. But she also had something Detective Foster never had: a starting point, a name, an identity, a life story that could be traced and investigated. Knowing who Jessie was meant knowing where he'd been, who he'd associated with, and what circumstances might have led to his death. Maria assembled a small task force, 2 other detectives, a forensic analyst, and a civilian researcher skilled in tracking down historical records and locating people from decades past. Their mission was clear: reconstruct Jessie's final months, identify everyone who'd known him in late 1977, and find someone who knew something about what happened to him. The team started with employment records. They contacted every construction company, factory, and day labor operation that had existed in Rutherford County and surrounding areas in 1977. Most of those businesses were long gone, but some had been absorbed by larger companies, and occasionally their old records had survived. Maria's team found payroll records showing Jessie had worked 3 days for a construction company in Murfreesboro in early November 1977, earning $45 in cash. It was the last documented proof of Jessie being alive. They tracked down the foreman who'd hired him, now 81 years old and living in a nursing home in Nashville. His memory was spotty, but he remembered Jessie vaguely. Quiet guy, good worker, showed up on time, did what you asked, didn't cause trouble. I remember he said something about heading toward Nashville to look for more steady work. That was the last I saw of him. Did he mention anyone he was staying with, anyone he was traveling with, any conflicts or problems? The old foreman shook his head. Not that I recall. Like I said, he kept to himself. Lot of guys like that back then, Vietnam vets who just wanted to work and be left alone. Maria's team interviewed dozens of elderly residents who'd lived in the area in the late 70s. Most had no memory of Jessie at all. He'd been too transient, too invisible, too much a part of the background to leave a lasting impression. But a few remembered him, and their recollections painted a consistent picture: a quiet, kind man who'd help you if you asked, but never imposed, who seemed to carry a heavy weight, who drifted from place to place without putting down roots. One woman, now in her 70s, remembered Jessie staying in a trailer on her family's property for a few weeks in the fall of 1977. My daddy let him park his truck there and sleep in our old camper trailer in exchange for him doing some repairs around the property. He fixed our fence, patched the barn roof, never asked for anything but a place to sleep. Then one day, he was just gone. We figured he'd found work somewhere else. Did he mention where he was going? Did anyone come looking for him? No, ma'am. He didn't say goodbye or nothing. Just left, and nobody ever came asking about him. The team also reached out to veterans organizations, hoping to find someone who'd known Jessie from his military service or who'd encountered him at VA facilities or veterans halls. They found a few men who'd served in Vietnam around the same time Jessie had, but none who remembered him specifically. The war had been chaos, and unless you'd served in the same unit or been through the same firefights, you might never cross paths with another soldier, even if you were in the same region. What became increasingly clear as the investigation progressed was just how alone Jessie had been in those final months. No close friends, no regular companions, no support network. He'd existed in the margins, interacting with people just enough to survive, but never enough to form lasting connections. And that isolation, that invisibility, had made him vulnerable. Maria's team began looking at unsolved crimes from the same time period. Were there other murders in the area that might be connected? Other transients who'd disappeared or been found dead? Any patterns that might suggest a serial offender targeting vulnerable individuals? They found a few cases that raised questions. A homeless man found dead in Nashville in early 1978. Cause of death undetermined. A transient worker who disappeared from a construction site in Wilson County in late 1977 and never been found. A Jane Doe discovered in Davidson County in 1979 who'd never been identified. But without clear evidence linking any of these cases to Jessie's murder, they remained separate mysteries, each one representing another forgotten soul. The forensic team re-examined every piece of physical evidence from the original 1978 investigation, hoping that modern technology might reveal something Detective Foster's team had missed. They used advanced imaging techniques on the clothing fragments, looking for trace evidence, fibers, hairs, anything that might have transferred from the killer. They analyzed the soil samples from the dump site, hoping to determine if Jessie had been killed there or transported from another location. The results were frustratingly limited. 47 years of degradation had destroyed most trace evidence. What remained was consistent with Jessie having been killed elsewhere and dumped in the woods, but it didn't point to a specific location or suspect. Maria knew that solving this case would likely come down to one thing: someone talking. Someone who'd been young in 1977 and was now in their 60s or 70s, carrying a secret they'd kept for decades. Someone who'd seen something, heard something, or knew something about what happened to Jessie Lee Williamson. The department issued a public appeal, asking anyone with information about Jessie or his disappearance to come forward. They emphasized that even small details, a conversation overheard, a person seen with Jessie, a rumor that had circulated back then, could be crucial. They set up a dedicated tip line and email address. The response was modest. A few people called with vague recollections that didn't lead anywhere. One person claimed to have seen Jessie arguing with someone at a truck stop in late 1977, but couldn't remember any details about the other person or even which truck stop it had been. Another caller insisted Jessie had been involved in some kind of illegal activity, but had no evidence to support the claim and admitted they might be confusing him with someone else. The most promising lead came from a man named Thomas Garrett, now 72 years old, who'd worked construction in Rutherford County in the 70s. He called the tip line and told Maria he remembered Jessie, and more importantly, he remembered Jessie mentioning that someone owed him money for work he'd done. "I ran into Jessie at a diner, must have been late November 77, Thomas said. He seemed agitated, which wasn't like him. He told me he'd done some roofing work for a guy who'd promised to pay him, but kept putting him off. Said he needed that money, was counting on it. I asked if he wanted me to go with him to collect it, but he said no, he'd handle it. That was the last time I saw him." Did he mention the person's name? Any details about where this roofing job was? Thomas struggled to remember. "It was 47 years ago, Detective. I wish I could tell you more, I've been racking my brain since I heard about Jessie being identified. I keep thinking if I'd pushed harder, asked more questions, maybe gone with him anyway, maybe he'd still be alive. Maria assured him it wasn't his fault, but the lead was tantalizing. Had Jessie been killed over unpaid wages? Had a confrontation over money turned violent? It was plausible, but without more details, it was just another theory in a case full of them. The reality Maria had to face was sobering. 47 years is a long time. Memories fade, people die, evidence degrades. The person who killed Jessie might be dead themselves, having escaped earthly justice, even if they couldn't escape their conscience. Or they might be elderly and infirm, living out their final years in a nursing home, their secret dying with them. But Maria refused to give up. She continued working the case, following every lead no matter how thin, re-interviewing witnesses, searching for that one piece of information that would crack everything open. She knew that cold cases had been solved after even longer periods, sometimes a deathbed confession, sometimes a family member who'd kept a secret finally deciding to speak, sometimes just a lucky break that came out of nowhere. Jessie Lee Williamson deserved that lucky break. He deserved an investigation that didn't quit, detectives who didn't give up, a system that finally delivered the justice it had denied him for nearly half a century. The case remains open, active, unsolved, but not forgotten. And somewhere out there, Maria believes, is someone who knows what happened. Someone who was there, or heard about it, or has been carrying the weight of knowledge for 47 years. If you know something, now is the time to speak, Maria said in a follow-up press conference. Jessie Lee Williamson was a veteran who served his country. He was a human being who deserved to live out his life in peace. Someone took that from him. Someone dumped him in the woods and left him to be forgotten. But he's not forgotten anymore. We know his name. We know his story. And we will not stop until we know who killed him. The investigation continues. The search for justice goes on. And Jessie Lee Williamson, finally resting under his own name in a veteran's cemetery, waits for the closure that has eluded him for 47 years. Because justice delayed doesn't mean justice denied. It just means the wait is longer, the work is harder, and the commitment has to be stronger. And for Jessie, that commitment remains unshaken. Jessie Lee Williamson's story didn't end when his name was restored or when he was laid to rest with military honors. In many ways, his story is just beginning not as a forgotten victim, but as a symbol of something much larger than one man's tragic death in the Tennessee woods. His story matters because it represents thousands of others just like it. Right now, at this very moment, there are approximately 4,400 unidentified human remains in the United States. 4,400 people who died without their names, without their families knowing what happened to them, without anyone to mourn them or demand justice on their behalf. They're stored in morgues, buried in unmarked graves, catalogued in databases as John does and Jane does, reduced to case numbers and forensic details. Many of them are veterans like Jessie, men and women who served their country, who put their lives on the line in foreign wars, who came home carrying wounds both visible and invisible. They struggled to reintegrate into civilian life, battled demons that society didn't understand or acknowledge, and eventually fell through the cracks of a system that had promised to take care of them. Many of them are transients, homeless individuals, people living on the margins of society who became invisible long before they died. They're the people we pass on the street without making eye contact, the ones sleeping under bridges or in shelters, the ones whose disappearance doesn't trigger Amber Alerts or massive search efforts because society had already stopped seeing them as fully human. Many of them are victims of violence, murdered by people who understood that killing someone invisible means the crime itself becomes invisible. No missing person report means no investigation. No investigation means no justice. No justice means the killer walks free, sometimes for decades, sometimes forever. For too long, these forgotten souls remained exactly that, forgotten. Their cases went cold not because investigators didn't care, but because the technology and resources simply didn't exist to identify them. Without a name, you can't notify family. Without family, you can't get DNA for comparison. Without DNA comparison, you can't confirm identity. It was a vicious cycle that trapped thousands of victims in permanent anonymity. But something remarkable has happened in the past decade. Forensic genealogy has shattered that cycle. The same technology that helps people discover their ancestry and connect with distant relatives is now being used to give names back to the nameless. DNA profiles uploaded to public databases by people looking for their family trees are inadvertently helping solve cold cases that seemed unsolvable. Third cousins and fourth cousins who never knew they were related to a murder victim are providing the genetic links that allow forensic genealogists to build family trees and identify remains that have been unidentified for decades. Since the Golden State Killer case in 2018, forensic genealogy has been used to identify hundreds of previously unidentified remains across America. John and Jane Does from the 1,970 seconds, 80 seconds, and 90 seconds are finally getting their names back. Families who'd spent decades wondering what happened to a missing loved one are finally getting answers, even if those answers come with heartbreak. Jessie Lee Williamson is part of that revolution. His identification represents not just one case solved, but proof that the system is finally catching up to the forgotten. That science and persistence can overcome decades of silence. That no one is truly beyond identification if enough people care enough to try. But identification is only half the battle. Jesse has his name back, but he still doesn't have justice. His killer, if they're still alive, has lived 47 years as a free person while Jesse lay in an unmarked grave. That's 47 years of birthdays and holidays, of sunrises and sunsets, of life continuing while Jesse's ended violently in the woods. That's why the investigation continues. That's why Detective Maria Gonzalez and her team refuse to close the file. That's why they keep following leads, interviewing witnesses, and appealing to the public for information. Because Jesse deserves more than just his name, he deserves accountability for the person who took his life, and he's not alone in that. Every identified victim whose murder remains unsolved represents an ongoing injustice, a case that demands continued attention and resources. The work doesn't end with identification, it ends with justice, or at least with the knowledge that every possible avenue has been exhausted in pursuit of it. Jesse's story has also brought renewed attention to how society treats its most vulnerable members. The fact that a decorated veteran could disappear and die violently without anyone noticing is a damning indictment of the systems that were supposed to protect him. The fact that he lay unidentified for 47 years while those systems continued failing other veterans, other transients, other marginalized people, is a call to action that can't be ignored. Veterans organizations have rallied around Jesse's story, using it to highlight the ongoing crisis of veteran homelessness and inadequate mental health support. Advocacy groups for the unidentified dead have pointed to his case as evidence that more resources need to be dedicated to cold case investigations and forensic genealogy. True crime communities have embraced his story, ensuring that his name and his service are remembered by people who never knew him, but who recognize the injustice of his death and the importance of his identification. Jessie Lee Williamson has become more than a victim. He's become a symbol of the forgotten who refuse to stay forgotten, of the power of science to deliver answers decades after questions were asked, of the importance of never giving up on justice, no matter how much time has passed. His distant relatives, people who never knew him in life, have become the keepers of his memory. They've shared family photos showing a young Jesse in uniform, proud and strong before the wars that would break him. They've shared stories passed down through generations about the uncle or cousin who served his country and never quite came home, even when his body did. They've ensured that Jesse is remembered not just as a victim or a case number, but as a human being who mattered, who had a life and a story worth telling. Today, Jesse rests in a veteran's cemetery under a headstone, bearing his name and his service record. Visitors sometimes leave flowers or small American flags, tokens of respect for a man they never knew, but whose story touched them. On Veterans Day and Memorial Day, his grave is included in ceremonies honoring those who served, his name read aloud alongside others who gave their lives for their country, even if his death came not on a battlefield, but in the woods of Tennessee, at the hands of someone who saw him as disposable. His story has been told in podcasts, documentaries, and news articles. It's been shared on social media by people who believe that every victim deserves to be remembered, every cold case deserves attention, every forgotten soul deserves to have their story told. And in being told, Jessie's story has inspired others, families of missing persons who've submitted DNA hoping for answers, investigators who've reopened cold cases they'd thought were unsolvable, genealogists who volunteered their skills to help identify the unidentified. If Jessie's story moved you, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Every week, I bring you real stories of real people who deserve to be remembered. Drop a like, leave a comment telling me what you think, and share this video so Jessie's story reaches even more people. Justice delayed doesn't mean justice denied, and together, we keep these stories alive. The investigation into Jessie's murder continues. Tips still come in occasionally, each one carefully investigated, even if most lead nowhere. Detective Maria Gonzalez keeps his file on her desk, a reminder that the work isn't finished. Somewhere out there might be the person who knows what happened, who's been carrying that knowledge for 47 years, who might finally be ready to speak. And if that person is reading this, if they're watching this video, if they're hearing Jessie's story and feeling the weight of their silence, it's not too late. It's never too late to do the right thing, to give Jessie's family the closure they deserve, to give investigators the answers they've been seeking. To finally, after all these years, let the truth come to light. Jessie Lee Williamson served his country with honor in 2 wars. He survived combat that killed thousands of his fellow soldiers. He came home and tried to rebuild a life from the wreckage of trauma and loss. He deserved to live out his years in peace, surrounded by people who cared about him, honored for his service and his sacrifice. Instead, he died alone and violently, was buried without his name, and spent 47 years forgotten by the world he'd served. But he's not forgotten anymore. His name is known, his service is honored, his story is told. And the search for justice continues, driven by investigators who refuse to give up, and a community of people who believe that every life matters, every victim deserves justice, and every forgotten soul deserves to be remembered. Rest easy, Jessie Lee Williamson. Your name is known, your service is honored, and your story will never be forgotten. You served your country. You survived wars that broke stronger men. You showed kindness even when life showed you cruelty. And now, finally, you rest with the dignity and recognition you should have had all along. The fight for justice continues, the investigation remains open, and somewhere the truth is waiting to be discovered. For Jessie, for his family, for every forgotten veteran and every unidentified victim who deserves better than silence and anonymity. Justice may be delayed, but it will not be denied. Not while there are people willing to fight for it. Not while there are investigators who refuse to give up. Not while there are voices willing to tell these stories and demand that the forgotten be remembered. Jessie Lee Williamson's story is a tragedy, but it's also a testament to the power of persistence, the advancement of science, and the fundamental truth that every human life has value and deserves to be honored. His name was Jessie Lee Williamson. He was a veteran, a son, a friend, and a human being. He mattered then, he matters now. And he will continue to matter as long as people are willing to remember his story and fight for the justice he deserves. Thank you for watching. Thank you for caring. Thank you for helping keep Jessie's memory alive. And if you know something, anything about what happened to Jessie Lee Williamson in late 1977, please come forward. It's never too late to do the right thing. Never too late for truth. Never too late for justice. Never too late for a forgotten soul to finally find peace.